The British Empire was the largest empire in human history, stretching across 25% of the world's land and 23% of the world population by 1913. It was truly massive. Notably, its control was spread out to every continent on Earth, because in fact Britain itself was much, much smaller. Instead, Britain spread its control across the globe in the form of what you may know as colonies. But what even is a colony? And what was the first colony? Strap your bronze shield and hoist the sail, because today we'll be talking about ancient colonialism. What a colony even is difficult to pinpoint, but it's fair to start in the Mediterranean. We can start with the ancient Phoenicians. They were a people dating back to the Bronze Age, and they were closely related to the Canaanites. They founded city-states like Byblos, Sidon, and Tyre, which were major trading centers connecting the civilization of Mesopotamia with trade from the rest of Europe. This is vital when you understand how bronze, which of course was a vital metal of the Bronze Age, was made. It's an alloy, meaning a mix of two metals. Bronze was first discovered mixing copper and arsenic, but it created highly toxic fumes that could kill the smelter. Luckily, we found a safer recipe: copper and tin. Copper can be found anywhere, but unfortunately, tin only has a few major deposits on Earth, and the Middle East is not one of them. Europe, however, is. So the Phoenicians were part of a vast trading network stretching from the modern-day United Kingdom to Kuwait. Tin wasn't the only good which the Phoenicians traded, however. There was a variety of trade activity going through Phoenicia. For example, the city of Byblos was a major trading center of the papyrus market. In fact, that is why the Bible is called the Bible. It was simply written on papyrus paper from Byblos. The land of Phoenicia itself was also enriched with acacia wood, which was useful to the barren lands of Egypt and Mesopotamia. Phoenician merchants sailed across the Mediterranean, but the various peoples they contacted were still largely tribal and had no cities or markets of their own. So the Phoenicians set up trade posts as established markets to trade with the locals. This was important as the various peoples of the Mediterranean had important resources to offer, as mentioned before, and the Phoenicians wanted it. Over time, these outposts became cities in their own right, vital parts of the trade network. One of those trade posts on the coast of North Africa was Carthage. Literally meaning new city in the Phoenician language, it was originally founded by the city-state of Tyre. The exact details, however, as to the founding of Carthage is shrouded in myth and legend, especially since it at one point became the wealthiest and most powerful city in all of the Mediterranean. The most famous story was that of Queen Dido. She was the queen of Tyre, but after her tyrannical brother killed her husband, she escaped to found the city of Carthage. Note, however, that these stories are from Greeks and Romans, not Phoenicians. The account from the Roman poet Virgil is particularly gruesome, involving a love affair that ends with her throwing herself in a pit of fire. Carthage, along with the other Phoenician colonies, became independent when Phoenicia was conquered by the Babylonians. Eventually, Carthage itself would come to control these colonies. These included Palermo in Sicily and Utica in North Africa. The Empire of Carthage may look neat on a map, but make no mistake, how they came to control such a vast territory was a mixture of defensive pacts, tribute systems, and the formation of outposts. But one thing was for certain. Unlike previous Phoenician colonialism, Carthage made sure that its colonies were in some form absorbed into the political state that was the empire. And that empire tightly hugged the trade network that had existed since the Bronze Age. It was this network which was the source of Carthaginian wealth and power, and it can be found in the land of Iberia. Remember, tin was sourced in Europe, and this included Iberia. And since Carthage controlled all the trade posts on the coast, they effectively ran a monopoly on the entire tin market. Not only that, Iberia also had other mineral wealth like silver. The Carthaginians were also active in the local politics of the various tribes they had contact with. Iberia was home to various Celto-Iberian tribes which Carthage hired as mercenaries. In fact, much of the Carthaginian army was mercenary hire. For example, the Carthaginian cavalry was made up of an antique Berber people of the African interior known as the Numidians. These Numidian cavalry were a formidable force in the Carthaginian army. The Carthaginian Empire would not last. First, there was the rising competition from the Greek merchants. Then Rome itself threatened Carthage entirely in the famous Punic Wars. In the chaos, Carthage's mercenaries also revolted. As a last-ditch effort of Carthaginian imperialism, the general Hamilcar Barca defeated the revolt and campaigned to conquer the entire Iberian Peninsula. Though the quick territorial expansion was impressive, it did not last. By the end of the Punic Wars, not only was the entire empire lost and conquered by Rome, but the city of Carthage itself was destroyed, never to rise again. Let's turn our attention east to another people active in the Mediterranean trade, the Greeks. Although the Phoenicians predate the Greeks in what we conventionally consider to be colonial activity, we can possibly trace it back even further. To do this, we need to go to Crete, an island on the Aegean Sea, and we also have to open our scrolls and look into the Greek legends. Specifically, we want to look at the myth of King Minos and the Minotaur. In the legend, the king of Athens is required to send tribute to Minos, king of Crete, every year in the form of 7 young boys and 7 young girls. As the story goes, these poor souls would be subjected to the labyrinth of the Minotaur, a monstrous creature of half man and half bull. How could such a story have any possible basis in reality? For decades, historians dismissed this story as complete fabrication, until some amazing archaeological discoveries were made. No, we didn't find bones of the Minotaur. Instead, ruins of a palace were found on the island of Crete, standing tall with bright red pillars, decorated with murals of bulls. This was identified to be Knossos, the capital of King Minos' kingdom. Accordingly, the civilization was given the name the Minoans. We have now found that their trade activity was immense across the Bronze Age Aegean Sea. What we have found is that the legends do in fact have some basis in reality, even if fantastically distorted over the ages. It's possible then that during this period the Minoans were in fact influencing and collecting tribute from the local communities such as Athens, making the Minoans a maritime empire. Nevertheless, the Minoan civilization didn't last long. Circa 1400 BC, they were conquered by the Mycenaeans, a mainland Bronze Age civilization ancestral to the Greeks. A couple centuries later, civilization on the island completely collapsed along with the rest of the Mediterranean, thanks to a cascade of earthquakes, volcano eruptions, and invasions from the mysterious sea peoples. So for hundreds of years, civilization around the Aegean took a back seat. The palaces were abandoned, peoples migrated around, and life was largely rural. Around the 7th century BC, city life started again in Greece. In Greek, the city was referred to as the polis. This polis was different from any other city-state in the ancient world, however, because each city had its own unique political system, ranging from tyrannies to democracies, and they were constantly shifting and changing even within their own histories. What bound together the polis, however, was the fact that they were all citizens. As Greece reurbanized, people began to venture out of Greece to settle new lands, but this was different from the migrations of the previous Dark Age. These instead were deliberate organized ventures. It was during this period, from the 7th to 5th centuries BC, that Greece would set up colonies across the Mediterranean and beyond. So why would Greeks set up colonies? Some reasons were similar to that of the Phoenicians, but others were more unique. But to understand that, we need to realize a few things about mainland Greek geography. First of all, Greece had rugged and hilly terrain. This was significant in ancient Greek history, giving geographic boundaries between city-states and allowing them to be fiercely independent from one another. Horses were also not suitable for the terrain, meaning that in warfare, infantry was largely used. Perhaps the most famous example of this was the Battle of Marathon. Because horses couldn't be used, messengers instead went on foot, sometimes running as well. According to Herodotus, during the Battle of Marathon, a messenger named Pheidippides ran all the way from Athens to Sparta in just one day. Another important effect of the Greek terrain was that it was difficult to farm on. This simple fact was enough for many Greeks to venture out and search for better arable land. Although farmland was a primary factor, colonies were set up for the extraction of other raw materials as well. So the colonization had to be very deliberate to find the perfect location for the best land. The polis would then choose an individual called an oikistes to lead the colonization effort. Let's take the city of Syracuse, for example. It was located in Sicily, a land which had very rich soil and was good for farming. In fact, Syracuse eventually grew to have a larger population than many cities back in Greece itself. The metropolis, or mother city, of Syracuse was Corinth, so the original founders were Corinthians. Some oikistes were actually exiles who were banished for various reasons. According to Plutarch, the oikistes of Syracuse, Archaeus, was exiled after he tried to kidnap a boy from a noble family, but was accidentally killed. The father called the gods to punish Archaeus, so the Corinthians exiled him. So, as the story goes, he set off to found Syracuse. Syracuse was far from the only colony set up by the Greeks. Many others were set up across southern Italy and the rest of the Mediterranean, and some even survive to the present, like Naples or even Marseille in France. Other colonies were set up in new places altogether, like the Black Sea. One colony on the Strait of Bosporus, connecting the two seas, later changed its name to that of a Roman emperor, Constantinople. Greeks were even given permission by the Pharaoh of Egypt to found a colony in the Nile Delta. Before even Alexander the Great, Greek influence was spread all throughout Antiquity. Another notable city was Miletus, just off the coast of modern-day Turkey. The Roman historian Strabo in Geographia tells us that Miletus was founded by colonists from Crete, possibly referring to the Minoan civilization. However, like Carthage with Phoenicia, the tables would turn and Miletus would become its own colonial empire. This metropolis had colonies across the known world, from Georgia to Egypt. It quickly grew in wealth thanks to its impressive commerce, and it was the home of many famous early philosophers as well. This included Thales, a mathematician who speculated to be inspired by many concepts in Babylonian and Egyptian math. Considering the vast colonial range of the Milesian Empire, it's not at all difficult to imagine how Thales could have been exposed to these ideas. In fact, it's even said that Thales visited the Milesian colony in Egypt, which would become a popular gimmick for many Greek philosophers, including at one point Plato himself. Plato was from Athens, yet Athens seems to be notably absent in the colonial race that I've been describing so far. Despite being the largest city in Greece, it had no colonies set up like the rest of Greece did throughout the Mediterranean. Yet its time to shine would be in the 5th century BC, exercising its power in a new way. This would arguably be the first bet for an overseas imperialism. So the colonies founded by Greeks beforehand were still tied to their mother cities in a cultural or de jure sense, even participating in wars for their mother cities, but they were still largely politically independent. Syracuse, for example, even outlived the independence of many cities in Greece itself. But Athens was different. Athenians didn't have emporia, but rather cleriches. Coming from the word klerich, meaning lot holder, a cleriche was a deliberate settlement of Athenian citizens in lands that were Athenian political territory. The cleriche system was essentially a weaponization of the institution of citizenship with the goal of imperial expansion. To understand why this was important for political expansion, we have to relate this back to the geography of ancient Greece. In Ancient Greece, unlike other regions like the Middle East, warfare wasn't fought merely between wealthy nobles and their expensive war chariots, but rather a collection of highly trained infantry known as the phalanx. The phalanx was the hallmark of Greek warfare, a rectangular formation of heavy infantry made up of citizens. This was, in its infancy, the citizen, the fighting man. So all people who would protect the polis would be citizens. For risking their life, citizens had rights or privileges, including the right to vote. Greeks then were fiercely tied to the identity of their mother cities, both in politics and warfare. Athenians then utilized Athenian identity to control territory outside of the city of Athens itself, and it did so with the clergy. Take, for instance, the city-state of Chalkis on the island of Euboea. It was itself a fairly prosperous city with many colonies of its own, that is until the 6th century BC when Athens conquered it. After the conquest, Athens set up a clergy. Again, this was essentially a garrison of Athenian citizens who moved to Chalkis. There are many reasons why an Athenian might want to join a clergy. Maybe they were poor and looking for a fresh start. Or maybe they were wealthy aristocrats looking to set up overseas plantations. In any case, clergies had Athenian citizens, and they were ready to fight. Take, for instance, circa 445 BC, when the indigenous people of Chalkis tried to revolt from Athenian rule. The rebellion was crushed by a local garrison of Athenian citizens. In the aftermath, the government of Athens imposed harsh restrictions on the Chalkis judicial system, limiting their autonomy further. The people of Chalkis were also forced to swear this oath to Athens. Notice the use of the word ally. Chalkis not only had a clergy imposed on it, but was also part of an alliance structure called the Delian League. The people of Chalkis were revolting in an attempt to leave this alliance. We don't normally imagine alliances to be forceful, and Chalkis was far from the first city to be forced into this alliance by Athens. So how did this all start? To understand this, we have to go all the way back to the Persian Wars, but that's an entire topic in itself, so I'll keep it brief. So the Persian Empire was the largest empire of the world at the time, stretching from Anatolia to the Indus and ruling about 40% of the world population. Yes, it was that big. It was ruled by the Achaemenid dynasty based in Pasargad, and founded by Cyrus the Great in the 6th century BC. As mentioned before, he conquered the whole of Anatolia. At the time, the Aegean coast of Anatolia was considered Greek, with much of the coast settled by a subset of Greek people known as the Ionians. For example, the people of Miletus were Ionians and subsequently fell into Persian rule. Persia placed puppet tyrants to rule for them across the various Ionian cities. But Miletus declared itself a democracy, beginning a region-wide revolt in 499 BC. Some independent Greek cities did militarily help the Ionians in their quest for independence. This included Athens itself. The revolt spread inland, however, and the wealthy Persian city of Sardis was burnt down. The Persians naturally wanted revenge. Subsequent Persian kings would try to conquer the whole of Greece twice, but ultimately failed. After a series of complicated and very famous battles, the Persian army was destroyed and the Ionians were freed. Or so they thought. During the Persian Wars, the two Greek city-states that led the Hellenic alliance the most were Athens and Sparta, so they naturally made up the most important decisions. The long-term fate of the Ionians wasn't agreed upon, however. The Spartan king Leotychides II believed that Anatolia can never be permanently secured, and that the Ionians should be moved to mainland Greece instead. Athens, however, had different plans. Athens had colonies across the Aegean after all. They couldn't just be abandoned. So, as Sparta stepped aside from the conflict, Athens solely took the lead. And so, the Athenian diplomats met with representatives of the Ionian cities on the holy island of Delos, and swore an oath of allegiance to each other. They then dropped iron ingots into the sea to symbolize the permanence of their alliance. Thus, the Delian League was born, and was much more permanent than any member state could have imagined. The official goal of the Delian League was to resist Persian encroachment, and they did do that to an extent, though not to much success. In 460 BC, Egypt revolted from Persian rule, and Athens sent a fleet of ships to the Egyptians, but it ended up being a failure as the bulk of the fleet was captured. Things at first started to run amok when some cities were forced into the alliance. Others weren't allowed to leave. Thucydides, a Greek general and historian at this time, chronicled a lot of the Delian League. He wrote extensively about member states revolting and trying to leave the alliance, but Athenian clerics forcing them back in. One of those cities was Chalcis, but there are many more examples. In 465 BC, the city of Thassos revolted, and the Athenians crushed it, and as punishment removed the city walls. That's not something you normally do in a defensive alliance. By 450 BC, Athens had orchestrated a complicated bureaucracy of tribute collection, as the League's treasury was now in Athens instead of Delos. To support the Athenian Empire, they employed tribute collectors, embassy offices, and garrisons across their holdings. Now, Thucydides was fairly unique as far as ancient historians go, in that he didn't just chronicle legendary tales as he heard it. Instead, he employed geopolitical reasoning to try to understand why events happened the way they did. And so his take on the origin of Athenian Empire is one that we could put particular focus on, especially considering that he was himself a former general of the Athenian military. In other words, at the very beginning of the founding of the League, members had a choice either to pay tribute in troops or money. Most members chose money, funds which Athens ultimately used to build up its own military. That military would also be used to crush revolts in the future. Had the Ionian cities instead chosen to supply troops, maybe things would have been different. I had mentioned before about the origin of the citizen, which was on the battlefield and in the phalanx. The story of the Delian League is an interesting one which potentially shows that the loss of one's own rights and freedoms first begins with voluntary dependence. Regardless, the Athenian Empire will not last. Sparta would come back into the picture as an Athenian colony and a Spartan colony had a territorial dispute, leading to the Peloponnesian War. Possibly the bloodiest event in ancient Greek history, this epic conflict, which I cannot do justice now, ultimately ended in a Spartan victory and the dismantling of the Delian League. Athens would never reach this peak again. Eventually, the whole of Greece would be absorbed into the rising kingdom of the north, Macedon. The king of Macedon, Alexander the Great, would set out to conquer the whole of the Persian Empire. In doing so, scores of Greeks would travel east to settle new cities, such as Antioch in Syria and Alexandria in Egypt. They would become massive metropolises, the largest cities of antiquity, only to be rivaled by a city in the west which we haven't discussed yet: Rome. So what about the Romans? It's here that we first see the mention of the word colony, from the Latin colonia. A colonia was a settlement of Roman citizens in a newly conquered territory. It's with the Romans that we see the most diverse use of colonies, employing all the strategies of previous empires and more. We're not sure what was the first colonia, but it was likely very close to Rome itself and settled for economic purposes. However, there was a political function as well. The colonia were influential in cementing Roman domination over the Italian peninsula. It's here of the Romans that we see a continuation of the version of the clerici system from Athens. Here, colonia of Roman citizens would be set up in recently conquered cities. These included the early Etruscan rivals of Rome, Veii and Fridene. Due to this policy, Rome was not only able to conquer, but assimilate lots of land, and eventually the entire Italian peninsula. However, the meaning of the word colonia was complicated because of its legal implications. So what a colonia was designated to be was up to change depending on the time period. For most of the history of the Roman Republic, there were two types of colonia. First, you had the Roman colonia, which were set up by Roman citizens, cives Romani. They were usually on the coast and set up for economic ventures. An example includes Ostia Antica, very close to the city of Rome itself and serving as its harbor. There was another class of citizen called the Latini, meaning Latin, and it was set up by much larger Latin colonia as military expeditions. The origin of the Latini comes from the Latin League, which we mostly know about from the Roman historian Livy. Livy was a Roman historian who wrote the Ab Urbe Condita, meaning from the founding of the city. It was an entire history of Rome up to the point of Livy himself, who wrote the book from 27 to 9 BC. Book 8 deals with specifically the Latin War, which will be important in a moment. First, some background. So there were many different peoples in Italy at the time of the early Republic. As mentioned before, to the south were many Greek colonies. To the north were the Etruscans, which included the cities Veii and Fridene. At the center, where Rome resided, were the Latin tribes. They organized themselves into the Latin League, a tribal confederation which either included Rome itself or Rome was an ally of. At a certain point, the Latin League decided to resist Roman power. This supposedly began with the Latins being once again threatened by the Samnites, a threatening tribe in Italy. And so the Latins sent an embassy to Rome requesting aid. According to Livy, however, they requested something else as well. Livy states that the Latins were seeking full Roman citizenship and representation in the Roman Senate and consulship. What their goal exactly was, however, is disputed. Remember, the Latin War occurred in the 4th century BC, so Livy himself lived centuries after this time. Livy, however, was closer to the events of the Social War, occurring in the 1st century BC. So Livy spoke to many older people who did live through the events of the Social War, and modern historians now believe that false parallels were drawn between the Latin War and Social War. Also consider that this neat speech given by Annius is entirely fabricated, as it was common for ancient historians to invent speeches. Modern historians now believe that the Latins were trying to achieve complete independence, not full Roman citizenship. Whatever the case, they failed and were incorporated into Roman hegemony. The result of this was the creation of a new legal distinction, the Latini. The rights of a Latini were more than nothing, including the right to commerce and to migrate, but the right to vote was notably absent. The Latini quickly evolved into a legal distinction applicable to anyone from criminals to colonists. Latin rights would be awarded to non-Latins, for example the city of Capua in Magna Graecia, which was awarded its citizenship without the vote in 338 BC. In the Republic, only residents of the city of Rome could vote, so colonists were Latini. As mentioned before, they were larger and served military purposes. So at this point, there were the cives Romani and slightly below the Latini. Below even that were the Socii. The Socii were people of allied states to Rome, but they had even less rights than even the Latini. By 91 BC, Rome had expanded to control the entire Italian peninsula, even crushing Carthage. And in 91 BC, some Socii demanded representation in the Roman consulship and Senate. The Senate vehemently refused and war broke out. The Social War. Sound familiar? This time we're pretty sure it happened this way. Rome managed to crush the revolts, but fearing future insurgency, awarded any non-Romans that did not revolt full Roman citizenship, including the right to vote. Thus, with the passing of the Lex Julia in 90 BC, the Latini and Socii distinction ended. The entire Italian peninsula gained full Roman citizenship. In 44 BC, Julius Caesar would grant the same to the people of Sicily. So with that also ended the idea of separate Roman and Latin coloniae. However, the colonization process during the Republic was fairly slow anyways, as you can see, mostly involving assimilating various peoples across the Italian peninsula. However, with the end of the Republic and the start of the reign of Emperor Augustus, things really kicked off. At this point, the Roman army was no longer just a random body of citizens, but a professional standing army. I won't go into much detail about the transition from the Republic to the Empire, but it involved a lot of civil wars, beginning of Julius Caesar and ending in Augustus Caesar. In the end, Augustus became victorious and had a massive army of 100,000 troops. So Augustus planned to settle all of these troops across the empire. This was a new problem to Rome, which Rome didn't experience before up to this time. In the past, armies were just citizens who were called up to fight when needed, but when war was over, they'd just go back to their old lives. But toward the end of the Republic, and especially during the Empire, a professional year-round army emerged. It became increasingly obvious, however, that when the soldiers eventually retired, they still needed something to live off of. It's not exactly a good idea to have a bunch of desperate retired war veterans wandering about. So the easy solution to this was to give land as compensation for their service. Rome was in definitely no shortage of land thanks to conquests like that of the massive province of Gaul. Sure enough, these coloniae of retired war veterans settled all around Europe, and many of these would become the famous cities of Europe today. This obviously had a massive impact on shaping the culture of these newly conquered territories, and especially language. By the 3rd century AD, Gaul seceded from the empire, yet its entire government spoke Latin and continued to practice Roman customs. The legal traditions of Rome were also carried on, with the Gallic Empire having its own consulship and senate. Colonia continued to be an important legal distinction in describing the legal rights of a town. Take for instance the modern city of Cologne in Germany. Its name comes from the Roman term colonia. Already being a city, it was granted the legal privilege of colonia by Emperor Claudius because his wife was born there. Many other cities, from York in England to Budapest in Hungary, would have their origins in Colonia, forever reshaping the landscape of Europe. The German city of Cologne would continue to exist even as the Western Roman Empire fell. However, Rome's legacy would always stay, and spread further into Germany and beyond. But that's a story for another time, a sort of medieval colonialism, if you will. For now though, this is where our journey ends. Thank you for watching. Leave a like if you liked it, leave a comment for feedback, and subscribe for more videos like this one. See you next time.